To a video on bootstrapping. Over the course of this video, we're going to talk about what bootstrapping is. We're going to talk about the reasons for bootstrapping, or reasons to suggest that bootstrapping is something that we want to do. And then we're going to get into some practical techniques that can help us as we try to secure financing for our ventures. So to start us off, let's talk through what is bootstrapping. It's important that we have sort of a working definition as we kind of get into more of the nitty-gritty. So bootstrapping really is what we call creative financing. And this creative financing is meant so that we can get by with as few resources as possible. Now, one thing I want to convey real quick regarding bootstrapping is really a mindset. It's not so much solely about financing, although that's really the purpose, right? We've have a business idea and we've evaluated it. We've determined that there is some degree of viability here, and now we need to get to a place to where we're kind of executing our business to an extent. But really, it's a mindset for how we look at paying for things, right? Not looking at solely as money as the means to actually buy things and pay for services. And really, for a lot of people, when we look at having the resources, we look at what money is, and that's one of the mechanisms, of course, to pay for startup expenditures and to pay payroll costs and to acquire inventory and all these different things. But the reality is if we look at money as the only way that we can actually start anything, then if we don't have money, the problem then is that we don't go anywhere. And so bootstrapping is looking at all of the available resources that we have at our disposal. Money, of course, is one of those resources, but is not the only resource. And so if we find ourselves getting into the mindset that really I just need money, well, then the reality becomes several years down the road, you're still in the same position because you still need money, and people aren't going to magically find you and hand you a bunch of cash so you can start your business. So if we really are serious about starting something, we've got to think about creative ways to get there. Sometimes we will not have money at our disposal. So there's a couple of reasons why we should get involved in bootstrapping. And one of them, as I kind of mentioned already, is this lack of access to capital, which is really a mindset shift. But one of the first big reasons as to why we should engage in bootstrapping is first what we call risk reduction. Now, we know that the perceived risk of something increases when we increase our commitment. So our risk is higher when we're increasing the capital involved, and ultimately we're increasing like the time invested in a venture. And so we know that based upon lean startup principles, our goal is we want to try to minimize these things and still get valuable feedback from markets, so that if things don't turn out the way we think they will, then we're not really out a great deal. Maybe a little bit of time, a little bit of capital, but not a lot. So by bootstrapping, what it allows us to do is it allows us to get started by using a minimum amount of resources. So instead of dumping boatloads of cash into the venture, if we just invest small amounts and if we try to engage in some creative practices that we're going to go into in a few moments, instead of really just using cash, then in the event that something doesn't pan out the way we think it does, we're really not into it for a great deal. And so reducing our risk is a primary reason for engaging in this idea of bootstrapping. The other thing that I would mention as a proponent for bootstrapping is it helps us to speed up our launch. We know that if we don't have access to money, and if we're constantly waiting for it, as I mentioned before, then we're going to be in a very precarious situation where, someone is saying, well, I'll give you money if you give me data and give me some market, information as regarding sales. And you say, well, I'll give you sales if you actually give me money. And so you're kind of in this situation where you can't really do anything. And so we know that there are creative things that we can do in order to try to create products and to get feedback and to get sales. And so part of that is we want to be able to speed up our launch. And so instead of waiting several years to acquire the funding, why can't we start now? Why can't we think creatively and acquire resources in a creative way so that we can get started today versus in several years or even several months? So let's talk about some techniques for bootstrapping. There are actually several, and some of these might not necessarily make sense for your business, but what you'll find is you might be able to use these in a brainstorming session and identify other possible opportunities for generating additional resources. So the first thing that I always recommend is trying to outsource initially. And outsourcing involves paying someone else for different services. And so as an example of this, you're probably thinking it's like, well, you just told me that I shouldn't spend money, and the first thing you tell me to do is to spend money, and that's partially correct, but partially not. So outsourcing is obviously taking a particular need of the business and having someone outside of the organization perform that. So that can involve paying somebody. So a common example would be handling your books in order to close out your books at the end of the month and reconcile your income statements and your bank accounts. You can hire a bookkeeper. That would be an example. But the other thing that you can do also to think creatively is you can actually look for volunteer work, and you can partner with some local organizations that a component of being in a certain program is volunteer work, and that can be a way for you to benefit from some pretty inexpensive labor. You can also look to interns if you have a community college or a university that's in your area and they have a particular program that might produce graduates that have certain skill sets that you might be in need of. You could offer to set up an internship where they get credit for completing a certain amount of work, and you in turn get some additional help and some much needed skills. So the point here is we're trying to alleviate the onset of payroll and commitments to ongoing employees. Now, I'm a huge fan of obviously paying people, since I employ many people and run different businesses. And so this isn't something I'm saying you should avoid paying for people. I'm certainly a proponent of paying people for the work that they've done. But early in the business, one of the things that you want to be really leery of is incurring what we call fixed costs. And we've talked about this before in the course. But those expenses that we have to pay, regardless of what income comes through the door, we want to try to eliminate those, or at least reduce those as much as possible, especially early in the business where we might not have a stable revenue stream. So instead of committing to payroll, what would it look like maybe if we used freelancers, like on a service like Upwork, where we can hire freelance people to perform a variety of skills, whether it's graphic design to make some logos, whether it's bookkeeping services to handle our monthly financials, whatever the case might be, right? Thinking about, I don't have to hire someone. Now, eventually, you'll probably get to the point where it'll make sense to have somebody on staff that you can ask questions to, and then could, obviously, you're evaluating their performance and you have more oversight and those sorts of things. But early on, you can kind of give up a little bit of that control, assuming you create a pretty decent structure, and it can eliminate this kind of ongoing expense that you're committed to, when the reality is you might not have enough revenue coming through the door to be able to support it. The second thing that I'd recommend as far as bootstrapping techniques is trying to rent or lease instead of buying. Now, under normal situations, buying is typically preferred, right? If you were going to use something for many, many years, buying typically works out better, right? But there's a break even as to when buying actually makes sense, because you have the initial cost. And the most important thing that you want to protect early in your business is your cash. Right? This is the most important thing that you have at your disposal. And if we purchase something, whether it's a piece of equipment that's relatively expensive, or a piece of property, or a building, we are using up a very critical resource that we can probably devote to other areas that are more important. Instead, maybe we can rent equipment. Maybe we can rent a space. Maybe we can find ways to reduce our expenses. One creative thing is, if you were going to operate a catering business or something where you produced food, instead of building an actual kitchen, a commercial kitchen, which can be quite expensive, maybe you can rent one. Maybe if you're running a bakery, you can find an existing restaurant, and in the off hours, use them so that you can obviously produce your product in a very kind of health compliant sort of way. So looking for creative ways to rent and lease can be very, very helpful. For a time, we used to outsource the use of our coffee roaster to different local businesses. And so they would pay a fee and they can use our roaster. And so that helped them avoid the purchase of a coffee roaster, which can be tens of thousands of dollars, typically on the lower end. And so that's a great way to kind of maximize cash flow and also make sure that you get access to a critical resource that you need to run your business. Third option for bootstrapping is you can actually share workspace. And this works really, really well, especially if there's another business that might need access to a space. And to reduce the cost associated with renting that particular space, you can kind of co-lease, which gives you a little bit of flexibility, but also gives you access to the physical location as well that you need. And there are a lot of different co-working spaces that you can use that can help with this, right? WeWork is the kind of the big company that's trying to go public, at least as of this video, and having some trouble doing that. But locally, probably in your community, I know in my community, there's probably 3 or 4 different co-working spaces, and they offer different plans that have varying degrees of financial cost associated with them. So you can get started for pretty cheap, and as your business grows, you can kind of graduate to a bigger kind of place. The next method of bootstrapping I'd recommend is obtaining what we call trial run data. Now, trial run data is basically running an experiment or a test that involves you selling a particular product. So instead of acquiring a bunch of something and then going through the process of trying to sell them, we try to test and fail on a small kind of level. And then assuming that data is encouraging, then we can kind of graduate a little bit more. So I'll give you one example that you can certainly look into further. And that company is Groupon, which we all know is one of the larger daily deals sites, went public several years ago. And Groupon got started as a PDF. And so in Chicago, the guys that wanted to create Groupon thought of an idea, and they didn't know if people would actually want to, redeem this discount in order to, kind of save a little bit of money. But also it has to make sense for the businesses, right, that are, foregoing a little bit of revenue and trying to get volume and that sort of thing. So their MVP, you might say, was a basic PDF. And they circulated that PDF to everybody in their office, and they just emailed it out via Gmail, right? So Gmail allows you to send, I think, 100 emails at a time. At least it did then. And so they literally have to add 100 people individually, then send it, then resend it. But they created just a simple, basic PDF for this pizza company that was downstairs at the bottom of this kind of big workspace. And they measured how many people actually used it, and they got some encouraging data, and for them that was enough to propel them forward, and they had some data to support that this idea wasn't completely crazy, and people would in fact kind of redeem the discounts and things, and it made sense for the business as well. So thinking about trial run data is really, really important. A lot of times we want to jump to the very end where we're operating a restaurant or a full-scale business, but there might be smaller things that you can do to gauge whether or not the business is actually viable and if there's demand for your business before you start dumping a lot of resources into it. The next thing you might want to think about is bartering. Now, bartering isn't necessarily common anymore in our economy, at least our economy here in the United States, simply because of the fact that we've got a paper currency that, although it changes in value, is fairly stable for the most part. And money has a lot of benefits, right? It's divisible, it's fungible, all those things, if you remember from your Econ 1A class, your macroeconomics, right? All those characteristics of money are the reason why we use money. It's easier to use. People understand it. It can be used for a lot of different things, and so it makes it easier to do. But when you're starting early on in your business, you might not have an abundance of financial resources, and so bartering might be a really cool thing to do for you to be able to get the resources that you need. So a basic example of this could be if you're thinking about running a bookkeeping service and you need a little bit of work for maybe a trademark or some kind of legal work. Maybe you can swap services with the legal firm. Maybe they'll be willing to, if you help them with their books, if it's a small firm, in exchange, you can get some actual legal services. So that could be one example. In my classes, I used to do a really fun exercise, which was called the Barter Challenge. And it was kind of built off of this old show that was on A&E years ago called Barter Kings. You can probably look it up and find it. I don't think it's on currently. I think it's been out of service for several years. But the idea was these two guys would start with one basic item of really small value, and then they would, in a series of trades, they would work their way up to something of more value. And so they'd start with like a fishing rod, and they'd work themselves all the way up to a boat. And the whole idea wasn't that these guys were like super smart, although seemed like they were smart guys. But the basic idea behind bartering is that value is subjective. And although something that's sitting in our garage has zero value to us because we've had it for years and never used it, it might have value to somebody else. And so by engaging in trading, you can, of course, exchange objects that are valuable. So like going back to the exercise I used to use in class, I used to require students to take an item that was valued at no more than $10, and they had to conduct a series of trades to try to get as much money as possible. We made it fun. We made it like a little game inside of class, and to see who could get the item of most value. And we'd have students that would start with pretty simple items, whether it's like tools in their garage or like old shoes or just random stuff. And they would get to things that are of like pretty good value. The greatest one offhand that I'm aware of is a student starting with like a fishing lure and worked his way up to like a really old 1980s like Honda Civic that actually ran. So those are just some examples of thinking creatively. And a lot of times, we have everything that we need for the financing aspect of it. It just takes a little bit of legwork for us to be able to kind of get there, right? We have to think a little bit more out of the box, you might say. One thing also, just in line with this idea of outsourcing, is from a production standpoint, you might also want to think about outsourcing to keep your costs down. But this goes back to understanding how to price. So if you're going to price your product, you might want to also include, maybe it's Amazon's fulfillment by Amazon fees and shipping fees. You can build that into the price of your product, and then you don't have to hire people to pack boxes and to ship things. Or another example could be if you have to produce a product, maybe you can get set up with the manufacturer that can do it for you. And so instead of hiring employees again to produce this thing, you can do it and make it relatively automated for the most part. So another way to possibly think creative. But ultimately, when we're looking at bootstrapping, we're trying to think about opportunities to get by with as few resources as possible. So whatever that looks like, I encourage you to spend some time brainstorming. These are just a few different options that I found that have been helpful, and over the years I've used a combination thereof for different businesses. But something for you might look a little bit different. But the reality is that if you have a great business idea and the funding is the issue, we got to look outside of monetary resources and look at other things that we can do to be able to move the idea forward.